Okay, everybody, hello again. Just getting the stream going, but we do have about 10 minutes as usual till we start. So for now, welcome back. Good to see you, Carson, Santino, a couple of the early people to the meeting. Just kind of get comfortable and we'll be ready to go in a little bit. Get one sparkling water drink. I'll be right back. Yeah. Okay, just hang in there. Just gotta wait a little bit. Hey, Jennifer. Hope your guys' last few weeks of the semester are going well as we get to the end. It's kind of like it's nice to be close to the end. It's also a little bit of extra work, with all the finals and other last assignments, but I feel good about being close to the summertime. But anyway, yeah, wishing you guys the best in your other classes too. Okay, just 7.5 minutes. Oh, hey, Jim, and I'm good. Just hanging in there, getting through the last few weeks of the semester, but it's nice to be at this point. I'm having a good day. I taught a few other classes earlier today. The one that I sometimes see you at in the mornings on Tuesday, Thursdays. I had that one up there in MH, and then I had another course after that. Little break, but yeah, here we are. It's good. Everything's going pretty well. Hey, Rosemary. And yeah, we're just hanging in there. Another 6 minutes. How much analysis do I want in the essays? Oh, I mean, yeah, if you include a quote, you should definitely. So with the quotation, you can set up the quote prior to the quote. You could be like, author Regan makes the case that animals should be regarded as things that don't have just instrumental but rather inherent value, as shown in this quote. And then you can like give the quote that explains the author's um, textual citation of the point you've explained, or you can integrate the quote and then afterwards be like, here the author states his view that, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, you always want to try and give some context in terms of explaining those quotes. When you say how much, I mean it's just a sufficient amount depending on the example, but typically it just takes a couple sentences or I mean, depend on the case. There could be sometimes where it's a complex quote that requires further elaboration. So that's a matter of a little bit of judgment for you, but definitely it's always best to not just drop a quote and move on, but either set it up or analyze it just after. I'm putting in a quick Canvas post, so that's why for a minute my eyes weren't on the chat. I'm just going ahead and making sure everybody attends, or at least I'm going to try to make them attend. So 1 second while I get into that. It's like I have another window open, so I'm not displaying for 1 second on my screen, you guys, but it's okay. No worries. Just my typical little announcement. Hey, the lecture is about to start. every little bit helps, to get good meetings. Okay. And cool. Now it's up. All right, back to you. Hello. Hi there, Justin, Leanne, Jasmine, Nick. Great to see everybody. And yeah, we're almost ready. We just got another 3 and a little over 3 minutes. Good afternoon, Jasmine. Welcome back. Violet, hey there. Hello. Anthony, welcome back. Good to see everybody. Anybody watching, if you have a chance, maybe you'll be able to fill out some of the SOQs for the class. I mean, it's not like a requirement, obviously, but it's sometimes nice for us professors if you have a moment. I think they expire tomorrow, so just throwing that out there if you have time. Good to go. Just another 2 minutes, or roughly 2 minutes. Elena, hey there. Okay, closing in on 90 seconds to get started. Okay, final countdown. Just 1 more minute. Hey, Karen, welcome back. Natalie, welcome back. And Andrea, good to see you too. Okay, guys, so let's get it going. Welcome back. Good to see everybody, and glad that you guys are with me. Today we get into our last lecture for the semester. Next week we have review sessions just to prepare for the final. Please also don't forget, obviously, that your second essay assignment's due on Tuesday. So just submit that to me um, before or on Tuesday the 5th. Sorry, Tuesday the 6th. And that'll be your second essay. I'll grade that, and I'll make sure to send back your comment and scores before we get to the finals week. Then it's just down to the final. As I think I mentioned, I posted the study guide for the final exam earlier this week, so it's on Canvas, and you can go ahead and look at that document whenever you want, and we'll use it to focus on and review all the course topics next week in our two last live streams. But then today, anyway, we have one more meeting to just talk about the literature in the book. So we were here Tuesday last time talking about the writing of Peter Singer again, but now on a different topic, the topic of economic justice. Do we have obligations to the global poor as members of the first world with expendable wealth? Do we have any obligation to provide some assistance financially, perhaps, to the global poor? Now, Singer, I'm just going to kind of summarize what we did in the previous meeting. There's a few points left over in his paper to just kind of complete. He starts by kind of outlining the difficult problems that we have in the world regarding poverty, hunger, and starvation. So there's a lot of people living in extreme conditions of poverty. A phrase that he uses to capture that idea is absolute poverty. Absolute poverty is not having enough income or wealth to meet the fundamental human needs of food, clothing, and shelter. And there's a large number of people on the planet that are living that way, meaning that they don't have enough money from either work or just family wealth to cover the fundamental essential things that are needed for survival and baseline physical and mental well-being. So, if you're living in absolute poverty, you're facing starvation, diseases, infections, and it causes people's lives to end prematurely. It kills a lot of children each year from starvation, millions of them. And in total, there's over a billion people, well over a billion people in the world living in absolute poverty. So he mentions that he's a utilitarian, and a utilitarian is always focused on, morally speaking, doing whatever creates the most happiness for the greatest number of people. And absolute poverty is a major counterweight to total human happiness. So he thinks that looking at the global status quo, we should hope to maybe do at least something to try and make a dent in the problem, improve on it, improve conditions for the absolute poor. Now, he says that this is a problem that we don't necessarily always see or think about because it's not something that our domestic news media really focuses our attention on. The international case of poverty. He mentions that in our own neighborhoods and inner city areas, there's definitely poverty and homelessness and things like that, but it still pales in comparison to the more extreme versions of poverty that you see in certain places around the globe where people look like a skeleton and they're starving to death. Now, he says furthermore that this is not a problem that you could just say is unsolvable or that there's nothing literally that can be done about it, because we make individual and collective choices which prevent there from being enough consumable resources for the global population. For one, we have a heavy reliance on animal agriculture and meat in our diets, and that results in a lot of inefficiency in the availability of consumable resources to human beings, because we have to redirect a lot of consumable resources to the cattle, pigs, chicken, and others to make them, reared up for market consumption. And what the evidence shows is that there's a lot of lost efficiency in that, because the same amount of consumable resources given to these animals could more easily be given directly to people if we weren't eating so much meat. He also says that there's a lot of waste in the amount of consumable resources that we purchase and then don't eat and throw away. So he wants to know, or he wants us to know, that there are things that we could do, at least in some manner, that would make some important improvements on the problem. So going from there, he says one thing that could be done is to direct some additional wealth, some charitable donations to the global poor to help, uh, assist. And he says we live with absolute affluence, which is having more than enough income and wealth to meet the fundamental human needs of food, clothing, and shelter. So, since we have more wealth than is needed to survive, couldn't we divert some of that surplus wealth to the cause of alleviating some of the global hunger and poverty? And couldn't we do it without even really undermining our own best interests in any serious way? Um, he talks about the rate of giving from industrialized first world countries in comparison to target goals that have been realistically set and that are achievable, but that even in those cases, we've fallen short of those goals. So he poses the question whether it's morally on par with killing if you fail to assist. He knows full well, though, that many people would probably disagree with the characterization that there's any similarity between the two. So he discusses a bit of differences between killing and failing to assist. Ultimately, though, whether it's difference of motive, certainty of outcome, identifiability of victim, easy to not kill but hard to save lives, or it's not my fault they're poor, but it would be your fault if you killed people. Even though there's differences there, he doesn't think that any of them fully eliminate the wrongfulness of the failure to assist for reasons that were mentioned. Like, for example, a drunk driver as opposed to a homicidal driver. If you compare the two cases, drunk versus homicidal driver, and you're asking like what the motive of the two people is, certainly the motive of the killer driver is worse, but that doesn't mean that this drunk driver's done nothing wrong. Even if they don't intend to kill, they very well could cause harm, and it just raises the probability that that would happen. So even in the absence of a bad motive, when you fail to assist, that's not comparable to the motive of a killer. It could still be seen as negligent and negligent of people's well-being, and to that extent wrong. And the same example can be given for this situation of the certainty of the outcome. If a person gets behind the wheel trying to kill people with the car, it's more certain that someone will die than it would be if they just got behind the wheel drunk. But still, the drunk driver is not excused morally from bad behavior there to be blamed. It's still wrong because it still raises the chances that someone will be harmed, even if it's not going to be the intention, and it won't be quite as certain that that would happen. And then there are other examples given to report back on the other differences. Finally, that leads into his argument for the obligation to assist. So the overall structure was, if you can prevent a bad thing without making a major or comparable sacrifice, you should do that. You should prevent the bad thing. Absolute poverty is bad. And then we can prevent some without making comparable sacrifices. So in conclusion, we should prevent some absolute poverty. And then just to those that have arrived, good to see all you guys. I don't know if I've said hello to everybody, but if it's Cayenne, Amanda, Julian, Sandra, Michelle, Zach, good to be with you as usual. So that was his argument. In terms of providing support for the first premise, if we can prevent something bad without making a comparable sacrifice, we should. He refers to this example of a drowning child. If there was a child drowning in a shallow body of water and you could easily rescue them without any risk to your own life, then it would seem to be a moral obligation to do that because the prevention of their death is more important morally than whatever sacrifice you have to perform to get them out of the water, if that's like a moment of time and some slight exertion. But even if we ratchet up the level of sacrifice to like an amazing outfit that you happen to be wearing that has to be destroyed in order to wade into the muddy water to get them out, that's still not as important, morally speaking, as the value of their whole life and future. So you should save this child's life, hypothetically, in the case we're talking about. If that's the kind of sacrifice that it demands of you, it would still be something obligatory. Now, with regard to the global poor, there's people starving all around the planet. And then, not to worry, hi Marina, there's people starving. And what he's saying is that because we have that additional wealth that was mentioned earlier, we could easily set aside a little bit for the cause of helping the global poor, and it wouldn't make us poor. It wouldn't bring us down to the level of dependence that they have. So he thinks that that's a good thing. Now, there's just this last part I wanted to cover, because there are some objections to his view that we need to understand a little bit. So I'm going to put some of that into our chat. Objections to his obligation to assist argument. Okay, so what we're going to do is just discuss and talk about some of the objections that people raise against his view. Now, the reason that he mentions these objections is because he wants to try and respond to them. He wants to show recognition of his critics' counter-argument so that he can pretty much like defuse the counter-argument. So one of the objections to his uh, argument and position, we'll give it a label and we'll call it taking care of our own. Okay, so with your um, collaboration, we're going to try and explain this point. Now, we've learned about the argument, I hope by now, which again says that if you could prevent a bad thing without making major sacrifices, you should. Absolute poverty is a bad thing. We can prevent some without making major sacrifices, so we ought to prevent some. But one objection against that, and again, what's an objection? It's a reason to find fault with an argument or its conclusion. One objection is we can call taking care of our own. Based on the name of the objection, it's probably a pretty serious hint as to what it's going to say, but let me ask anyone here if they think you can figure it out. Suppose someone heard Singer's argument and their reaction was, no, I don't have an obligation to assist the global poor, because if I have an obligation to assist anybody or care for anybody, it's not the whole global community, it's just who? Any thoughts? Based off of the name of the objection, you might be able to give a fair answer. What might somebody say? Like, I'm only obligated to what? Not care for the entire international community, but just, well, Julian, that's a little bit too minimal. Myself, no. My community, my family, there you go, Santino. Yeah, our own. And so somebody might say, my obligations are more limited. They're more restricted to a class of people that's a little bit more related to me, closer to me, more familiar to me. So like I have obligations maybe to care for people, but not everybody that needs help, just my own. And who could my own be? Santino, I like your suggestion. Like maybe my family, maybe my community, maybe my friends. You might be willing to extend your sphere of moral concern slightly farther and say like my fellow citizens, maybe that are living in poverty. But a person might reasonably argue that that's as far as my obligations could possibly extend, that I cannot be reasonably expected to have a moral obligation to people far and wide throughout the planet that are suffering with global poverty. So if I have obligations to care for people, it's a more limited set of people that are somehow more directly related to me. And it does not include, therefore, people at distant shores in the international community that are suffering from global poverty. That's an objection, but Singer, he wants to counter the objection. So here's how Singer tries to respond to this criticism. He has a few interesting points of response. One is how far away someone is from you, like in terms of their geographic distance from you. He thinks that really should not matter in terms of what you feel your obligations are to other people. The only thing that he thinks should matter is what their needs are and what ability you have to assist their needs. Sure, there are people closer to you physically, like your friends and family and fellow citizens. They're much closer, physically speaking, than people, living in countries where there's absolute poverty and they're starving to death. But he thinks out of sight, out of mind is just like a psychological phenomenon. Just because something's out of sight and therefore you're not thinking about it doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't exist. There's still human beings out there with needs. And in his view, it's still an obligation on us to try and do something to address human needs wherever they are. He then says another thing that I think is also interesting. He says that how you limit the circle of moral concern around geographic proximity, my own, he sees that as arbitrary. And in a way, he thinks that it's on parallel with a person who makes this claim. I only care about my own. And when I say my own, I mean people who are racially similar to me. Now, if anybody said that, you'd think that's racist. That's bigoted. If I told you right now, I only care about white people because that's my own racial category, you'd think, wow, this person really doesn't have a very fair and just appreciation of his obligations to fellow human beings because he's limiting his concern only to people that are racially similar. And what Singer says is, what is the difference between saying I only care about people that are my own, spelled out in terms of geographic proximity and etc., as opposed to I only care about people that are my own, spelled out in terms of race. He thinks that if one is bad, so is the other, and that they're on par with one another. So at the cost of sounding like you have an arbitrary set of individuals that you prioritize for moral concern, he would find that faulty. And then one other thing, he also says the needs of your own, they're just not on, they don't compare it to the needs of the international poor that are starving and living in global hunger and poverty. Your own are people close to you. And so those are people living in the first world, fellow citizens, friends, and family members. So they don't need to be taken care of. They're pretty much fully self-sufficient anyway. So how, he asks, can you care more about the trivial and insignificant needs of your own over the life and death needs of people that are in international communities suffering with global poverty that are not so-called your own? So those are his trio of replies to this objection. First off, geographic proximity shouldn't be the arbiter of moral concern. Furthermore, isn't it similar to the racist principle that you only care about people who look similar to you? Or at least it's not really much different conceptually than that. And then third, why do you care more about the needs of your own when they're just trivial and insignificant by comparison to the more serious, dire needs of people living in absolute poverty? So that's one objection, and responded to by Singer. Here's another objection then coming next, objection 2. The second objection is related to the concept of property rights. Property rights. Okay, so here's another possible objection. And then, by the way, I don't know if I said hi to you guys, but Julian and Juliet, good to see you guys. Property rights. So arguably, if you don't agree with Singer's conclusion that we have some moral obligation to assist the global poor, maybe the reason you might object would be because you're thinking, well, that stands in the way of my property rights, because if I have property, I'm entitled to do whatever I want with it, and because it's mine and I own it. Now, when we think of the word property, sometimes we think of the things that we buy with our income and wealth. So if I go and buy a car, the car is my property, and that's obviously true. Or if I buy a house, a guitar, anything that I purchase, you can say it's my property, and it is. But question, isn't the money itself that you have in your account, which you can convert into goods and services if you purchase them, or just allow it to capitalize and gain interest in the bank, isn't the money also your property? And you have to say yes, because it's something that you derive from your labor or your family wealth. So it belongs to you just as much as the items that you might purchase or the services you might purchase with it. So again, if your wealth, money, is your property, then your property rights pretty much entitle you. Hi, Tyler. Your property rights, if your money is your property rights, therefore, ought to entitle you to do whatever you want or don't want with your money. You can spend it on what you wish or not spend it on what you don't want to. And that even gives you the right to do silly and, let's be honest, counterproductive things with your wealth. You're entitled to do that because it's your money and it's your right. So, for example, suppose that you see this watch? This is a decent watch. It's not like a Rolex, but it does cost maybe $1,100. It's a nice Garmin watch. It's used for tracking fitness, sleep, but also just every day. I can change out the band and it becomes a silicone band if I put on the other one, and then I can use it more for workouts. But anyway, it's a decent watch. Now, it's my property. I bought it. What if I decide tonight that I want to put this watch on like a table surface and smash it with a hammer to smithereens? Would you say I have the right to do that? Do I? Do I have the right? I definitely do. Now, would it be smart? Would it be productive? Definitely not, because it would destroy the function of the watch. But you can't say I don't have the right to do it. And the obvious reason is because why? Why do I have the right to destroy this watch? Obvious enough, I know, but let's just say. Because it's mine, because it's my property. I bought it, it's mine. So, look, if I'm just a weird person and I like buying expensive items and then destroying them in that way, you can't tell me I have no right to do it because it's just my money. And if I'm wanting to waste it that way, it's fair game. Suppose that I go to Vegas today and I decide I'm going to put $10,000 on the roulette table, bet it on black. Do I have the right to do that? I certainly do. Could I lose all the money? Definitely. It might not be a smart investment. It might not be a smart financial decision. But again, you can't tell me I have no right to do that with my own money if I want to, because it's my money and I'm at liberty to waste it dispose of it in whatever random way that I want. So, according to that view, if my money is mine and it's my property, and I'm entitled to do things that don't even serve any practical purpose, these things that I'm talking about might even be self-destructive. What if I want to buy a whole bunch of alcohol and cigarettes and just drink a lot and smoke a lot, buy a bunch of unhealthy food, and put myself in an early grave? Am I free to do that? Yes, sadly, I am free to do that, and some people will do that. It's not necessarily smart, but you can't say you don't have the freedom to do it in a free society where your liberty to spend your money as you want is yours. So back to the point. Singer says we have a moral obligation to give some of our wealth to the cause of assisting the global poor. But a critic might say that kind of stands in the way of my property rights. That would be like saying I have an obligation to surrender some of my property, my money, to a cause which, even if it's worthy, I'm not obligated to do anything noble, virtuous, or morally upstanding with my wealth if I don't want to. Now, that's the objection, the property rights objection. I hope that makes some sense. But again, Singer, he believes in his argument, and he's going to defend it against all the objections. So what he says in response to the property rights objection is basically a few things. First, he says, he kind of concedes one point. He says, yes, in fact, I mean, it is your property. Your money is your property, and you are at least legally entitled to do as you see fit with it, whether that's something beneficial to anyone else, altruistic or not. But the question in his argument is not about our legal entitlements, but rather about what's morally right and wrong. And just because you are legally permitted to do something, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good thing to do. So this is an important point to keep in mind that Singer's mentioning. So I'm going to put in the chat so that you remember it more easily. So I just put this note to kind of summarize the point that I'm making, which is having the right to do something, X, we're just saying X for the sake of, because it could be anything, but having the right to do something is not the same as it's a good thing for you to do that. So question, do you have the right to drop out of college if you don't want to attend or take any other classes? You definitely do have the right to do that. You can't be forced against your will to continue to attend these classes and to pay tuition or whatever. So do you not want to take the final? If not, this might be your last lecture ever, but I'm being facetious. Obviously, the point is that even though you have the right to withdraw from college, it's not necessarily like it's a good thing for you to do that. This kind of recalls to mind the argument given by Douglas Husak way back in the drug topic, where he said, just because people have a right to use drugs doesn't necessarily mean that they ought to or that we're encouraging them to do that. So it's similar here. What Singer's saying is just because you have the right to withhold aid from the poor, not give to charity, that's not the same thing as it's a morally good thing for you to do that. You have the right to do all kinds of things. You have the right to change your religion or adopt a new one, or you have the right to go out in public wearing a chicken suit. But these things, most all of them, even if you have the right to do them, they might not be well advised. They might not be beneficial or morally worthwhile. So he kind of says, yeah, even if you have the right not to give to the poor, we're not asking what your legal entitlement is. We're asking rather what's morally good. I mean, you have the right to never, be nice to anybody for the rest of your whole life if you don't want to. But just because you have the right to do that, that doesn't settle the question as to whether it's morally right for you to not do that. Now, the other thing he says is, who's the one making this case that the property rights entitle you to not assist the poor? Is it a Christian? Because he knows that probably a lot of his readership based in the West is going to be based on statistics like majority Christians. And if you're a Christian, take a look at the Bible, especially the New Testament. It does not say, forget the poor. These people should just get their own money and just take care of yourself and your nuclear family. It doesn't say those things. Instead, it says quite the opposite. There's so many phrases within the Bible that express this kind of moral requirement that Jesus emphasizes, that we should take a supreme interest in like the least fortunate among us. So just to pick out a couple of random quotations from the Bible, it says, be your brother's keeper, the meek shall inherit the earth. It's harder for a wealthy man to enter the kingdom of heaven than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. And that's just a small sample. So at any rate, if you follow the Bible, he says, you're being a little inconsistent with your self-described moral beliefs and religious beliefs to act totally indifferent to the sufferings of the poor. So that's what he said about property rights. On the one hand, even if you have these rights, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's morally good to act that way. And on the other hand, if you believe in Christianity, then you're kind of contradicting your own moral principles if you take absolutely no interest in providing help or assistance or care for the poor. Now, another objection, let's go into next, objection 3. This one has sometimes been called the triage objection. So let me try and explain that. Now, triage. I don't know if any of you have ever heard this word or concept. Sometimes people have. Let me just throw it out there. Anybody? If you haven't and you don't know about it, can you say no? So at least I get a sense of, your reaction. But if you have, you can tell me. Okay, then fair enough. Santino's saying you've never heard of triage. Marina, you've heard of triage. Okay, good. So, kinda, Jennifer. All right, I see there's like some partial understanding out there of the concept. I'm going to definitely give you a full-blown breakdown of it, but can you give me even like a vague statement of what you think it might mean? Triage, what kind of scenario does it apply to? What's the concept related to, if anything? Maybe. If you can't express it, that's fair, but just checking. Sometimes it's good to see where your guys' pre-existing knowledge is. If you know. It's okay if you don't, but let me just give you a second if you have thoughts to collect on that. Well, okay. Jennifer, good. You say sorting based on how urgent needs are, for example, with patients. Very good, exactly. That's essentially it. And Marina, you add, medical professionals do it to decide the urgency of the needs of the patient. Perfect, yes. Okay, good. So let me just expand on that a little bit. Triage is like a medical policy that is implemented when you have a couple of factors. On the one hand, you have an overwhelming number of people that are either sick or injured, and you also have like a deficit of medical personnel and resources to provide one-to-one care for each patient. So what do you do when you have like too many injured or sick people and not enough doctors or hospital beds? In cases like that, you have to employ the triage policy, which is supposed to now kind of ration care in a way that will hopefully make the most efficient use of these scarce medical resources to maximize the total number of lives that you can save. So the word triage has a prefix within it, tri, which means 3, like a tricycle or a triangle, and so on and so on. So with triage, the way the policy works is typically you'll have 3 separate categories of people from the injured or sick population, and they're classified according to the level of seriousness of their injuries or illness. So for just a moment, I think this is best dealt with the board. Let me just kind of break down for you the 3 categories in triage, okay? So in triage, we have 3 separate classifications of injured or sick people. On one side, we have the people with the most serious injuries of all. So these are people who will probably die, unfortunately, even if you try to help them, even with help. So that's one group. These are people that are probably, unfortunately, destined to die just because of how bad their injuries or their illnesses are. So it says, if you can't read it, people who will probably die even if they received help. Now, by the way, when and in what situations might triage be deployed? Here's a few cases. Suppose there's a battlefield of war and some attack happens on a group of soldiers, which immediately causes like a big wave of injuries to all happen at once. And that overwhelms the medics that are there that are capable of providing care to the injured. So you just now have like a overabundance of injured people, not enough medics. Or another case, it could have to do with illnesses. Remember the COVID pandemic? So at the heights of the pandemic, some hospitals were getting overwhelmed by too many people needing ICU beds or too many people needing ventilators, and because there's so many people all getting sick at once. And if there's more people sick than there are doctors and resources to care for them, here again, you'd have to maybe distinguish these categories of different levels of injury or illness. So on the one hand, we have these people that will probably die even if they get help. So the sad thing about this group is that they're kind of like a lost cause, to say a phrase, meaning that even if you try to attend to their needs, they're too far gone, and they're probably going to succumb to their injuries, wounds, or illnesses and die, even in the case where you try to assist. On the opposite extreme spectrum, we have the people with the most minor injuries. These are people who, although they're injured or sick to some extent, they're not in a live or die situation. These are people who, now let's say, people who will probably survive How do you think I'm going to complete that statement? These are people who will probably die even with help. These are people who will probably survive even what? Just wait for the chat to give me that answer real quick. People who will probably survive even what? This group, super injured. They're going to die even if you do help. This group, lightly injured. Yes, Marina. They'll probably survive even without that immediate help. So in the battlefield type scenario, this would be like the walking wounded. These would be people, they suffered some type of injury, but they don't need urgent like assistance. They can defer care till later because they're not in the case of like, they don't have a realistic chance of dying from these injuries or illnesses. So badly injured or sick that they're going to die pretty much in any case. Such a minor injury or illness that they're probably going to survive even if they don't receive care, at least they don't need it right away. But then we have the all-important middle category, okay? And this is a real group to focus on because these are people who will probably, what do you think? They'll probably, so they're going to die even if you do help them. They're going to live even if you don't help them. But this is a group of people who will probably, what do you think? Let me know. Yeah, so they'll probably survive with help or die what? Survive if they get help, but die if, let me know. Survive if they receive help and die without it. Exactly, guys, good. So people will probably survive with help or die without help. Okay. So now you got your triage technician or triage nurse, and they're going to flag people in the injured or ill population into these three different separate categories. Now, let's go through the logic of how triage is then implemented. Suppose that you have this first wave of medical responders, doctors, medics, whatever, and you're sending them out to the scene where all these different injured and sick people are. Question. Would it be the most efficient use of these medical resources to send them to this group exclusively at the beginning, or no? Would we save the most lives if we diverted our precious, scarcely available medical resources to this category, to the most injured category? Or no? Would that help save the most lives, or would it not? No. So sorry, Santino, that's not correct. Also, Marina, no. So to others or to the same people, reconsider what you're saying and think about the logic. I'm asking you, are we going to save the most lives if we send attention to the people in this category? But you see the description, right? These are people who are going to die even what? Even if they get help. So it would be wasteful. That's right, Jennifer. While you're trying to save these people, okay, they're dying no matter what you do. But you're neglecting another group of people who are waiting on help where the help would more realistically save them. These people are more savable, and these people are just too far gone. So if you only have a certain number of doctors, right, and you're expending those resources on the most injured, the most gravely injured people, you're wasting the resources because they're not going to be capable of being saved in most all realistic cases, but these people could be. So while they're dying no matter what, there's people over here that are being ignored that could have realistically been saved. That makes sense? I hope that makes sense. That's the whole point of this. So like it would not be efficient in terms of maximizing life saving to divert the precious medical resources to the worst injured category of people. Now, on the other extreme, this is maybe more obvious, right? Should we send our first wave of medical attention to this group or no? And why or why not? This group I'm talking about now, the ones that are their injuries are so minor that they'll probably survive even without help. Would that be the best use of these resources or would it not? And if you could explain why, or it would, or why it wouldn't. No, okay, good, again. No, because they're surviving anyways, exactly. So while you're focused on these people with like minor, like little scratches and bruises, there's people over here that are like literally dying that are not getting that help. Sorry. So if you're sending your resources to this group, you're basically wasting them, whereas there's others that could be helped with the same level of assistance more realistically. If you're sending your first assistance to this group, then you're also wasting the resources because the same resources that are being used here on people that are not essentially requiring it could have instead been directed at this group and then actually saved lives. So this group's going to die even if you try to help them. This group's going to live even if you don't try to help them. So this is the all-important critical middle group. These are the people who are right on the bubble. If they get help, that will cause them to survive. And if they're not going to receive help, that means that will lead to their death. So if you had to choose then, which group should be the exclusive focus of our first round of medics when there's not enough for all these injured people, you'd try your best to focus attention on this category because this is the group of people who could be saved. These are people who don't need to be saved, and these are people who are beyond help. But this is a category of people where the help will make all the difference into whether they live or die. See, the help doesn't change whether these people live or die because they die anyway. And help also doesn't change whether these people live or die because they live anyway. So now, back to the bigger picture. Some people have objected to Singer's argument because they argue that it violates the logic of triage principles. Because what he's arguing is that we should be helping and sending out assistance to the poorest of the poor on the planet. And arguably, someone might think that's similar to saying that when we have a whole bunch of injured people in a triage scenario, that we should try and provide our best assistance to the people in the most injured category. But if you do that, you're really not really fixing the problem in a sense. Now, as applied to the case of international aid to the global poor, you can say that when you send money to those populations, you're not really addressing the root causes of poverty. You may be giving a little food or money for the time being to extend their lives, but basically they still remain in poverty. And that means that the underlying cause of their needs persists on. And in a way, you could argue that you're maybe facilitating the problem to become worse because this could lead to the increased population size of the cohort of poor people in the third world. And in a way, that might actually lead to a bigger problem in the future that gets deferred into the future when there's still now even more poor people through the provision of international aid that have been produced. And we still haven't addressed the root causes of poverty. So when the group becomes too unsustainably large, trying to withdraw aid from them at that time could potentially lead to an even bigger cataclysmic dying off of human beings than would have been the case if you never did anything, in which scenario their numbers would have gradually dwindled through the natural effects of like famine and etc. Now, that's the triage objection. So I guess it's like the people in the worst case of poverty are like in the lost cause category, so it would be unwise to try and help them. And in a way, you might actually contribute to the problem by increasing that population size, which makes more poor people with more needs, and thus we are back to square one. People in the first world, they don't need any assistance. They're going to survive regardless of any help. If any people then would be the sort of logical recipient of such aid, you might say it's not the most extreme cases of poverty, but those that are in a developing economy, which is making a transition to a more stable economy. But those are not necessarily the people that are implicated in Singer's argument. He's really asking us to care and provide for the people in the worst case scenario. Now, how does Singer try to respond to this complicated objection? Singer says that in a way, if the stated concern of the critic is facilitating population growth in the third world through the provision of international aid, that there's a more humane alternative to getting to the result of reducing population size in the third world than by withdrawing assistance and seeing the death rate increase. Instead, he says, we can actually hope for not an increased death rate, more people dying from not getting enough food, but a decreased birth rate. And a decrease in the birth rate is actually something that has been shown to be achievable through certain forms of international aid. For example, contraceptive access, which is not always reliable in some of the parts of the world where this poverty prevails. International assistance in getting contraceptive access out to more people also is shown to result in more careful family planning decisions that reduces population growth a little bit. Also, education and emancipation of women also shows in studies that that allows them to be more autonomous and have more contribution to family planning decisions, which also leads to a slowing of population growth. And then in general, if we were to assist these third world nations, we can hope that they would eventually make transition to a higher standard of living, at which time they would start to see their reproductive rates decrease in line with what's already seen in the first world generally, and there's a lot of evidence of this. First world wealthier nations have lower reproductive rates than nations where there's more poverty. And there's all kinds of socioeconomic reasons for that. But at any rate, if we did help some of those poor nations, maybe they could enter the ranks of the more developed nations, and then their population increase would start to slow in the same way that we've seen in our country and in others. So Singer, therefore, has that kind of response given to the whole triage objection to his argument. And then, okay, and then thank you, Ryan. Yeah, I appreciate your comment. One more objection. So objection 4, leave it to the government. So one more pushback on Singer's argument that's discussed by him is some might argue, look, if there's assistance to be given to the poor, financially or otherwise, it shouldn't be the individual responsibility of private citizens. It shouldn't be left to people to write personal checks to agencies or organizations to help serve those needs. Instead, it should be done on the basis of government programs that send that money out. Why? Well, for one, there would be a more stable source of revenue because it would be drawn from all of our tax appropriations, and we would all be mutually invested in it instead of it being subject to individual decision making. Also, because of that, it might be a more reliable stream of funding, because if we leave it to private charitable giving, then the amount and the rate of giving is always going to be dependent on the personal charitable feelings of the donator. And charitable feelings are sort of inconsistent. They could be here today, gone tomorrow. You could watch like a sad documentary about tough living conditions in the third world, and then you're like, okay, I'm moved by that. I'm going to write a check. I want to do something. The next day, you watch like a brutal horror movie and you're feeling nihilistic and you're like, you know what? None of this matters. We're all doomed. I'm not going to do any of those things. So it's like your feelings in terms of how compelled you are to contribute something can kind of be here today, gone tomorrow. But if it's a government program, then it's stable and likelier to last because it's not up to individual whims. Another thing that he doesn't really talk much about, but I've seen some interesting arguments about this, that sometimes wealthy individuals or businesses will use conspicuous philanthropy, like charity to the poor or whatever, as a way of creating positive PR for their businesses or their individual persona to shield themselves from criticism of maybe less benign business practices that they engage in. So if this was something that was the exclusive domain of the government in terms of the charitable sending out of money to third world countries, then you might also deprive some of these wealthy individuals and businesses from this sort of easy PR that might in fact be kind of concealing some of their less noble business practices. Now, how does Mr. Singer respond to this new objection? His response to this one, I think, is actually pretty straightforward. He says, basically, why not both? He argues, even if government assistance to the poor would be good, that's no reason to exclude individual charitable giving too. These two things are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they should be thought of as mutually reinforcing. The government, after all, would probably be less likely to impose a philanthropic burden on us that we didn't seem to be willing to do ourselves. And I would say, even though we're looking at a paper that one version he wrote in 1972, another version he wrote in 1993, today in 2025, with the current administration we got, they're dismantling a lot of these international aid agencies that are operated through our government, USAID and stuff. So it's probably one of the least likely times for America, at least, to take on significant charitable obligations apart from what private citizens are willing to do. So, that's a full discussion then of the singer, and it just took me a while to make sure I covered all the remaining points from him. Now, there is listed on today's date in the calendar one more author, and that's Garrett Hardin. Full disclosure, I'm not a huge fan of Hardin, but he offers an argument that's the exact opposite of Singer. So, at any rate, I do want to at least talk about some of what he said, and we'll see how much we get through. Okay, so yeah, sorry, I'm just getting my pages set up. One more author then, and it's this man. His name is Garrett Hardin. Let me get his life dates. I want to make sure that I tell you about that. Okay, born 1915, died 2005. Is it 2 T's? Is it 1? 2 T's. Garrett Hardin. So Garrett Hardin, who lived over those years, and his essay, let's see the title again. Yeah, Living on a Lifeboat, 1974. So Garrett Hardin, Living on a Lifeboat, 1974. So Garrett Hardin, he does not believe we have a moral obligation to assist the global poor. Far from it. He thinks not only are we not obligated to do that, but he actually thinks that it's counterproductive in the big picture, even to try to do that. So back in the 70s, when he wrote this paper, there was this kind of burgeoning environmentalist movement that's become obviously a much bigger deal by now. But it was kind of newer back then. The thing is, to see real impacts of human activities and human industrialization on the planet's ecosystem, it takes a little while before we really start to see that pick up in the middle and later 20th century. For much of human history, before we had carbon fuels or industrial processes and a huge global population, you might have looked at the planet. Imagine yourself living 500 years ago, and there's just no industrial anything. There's no cars, there's no trains, there's no emissions. You'd look at the planet and you'd be like, wow, this is just unlimited, bountiful stuff. We can never exhaust these resources. There's way more that we can use. So there wasn't necessarily a lot of awareness socially or otherwise about conservationism and sustainability, reforming our contemporary practices to protect the planet. But you start to get into the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and then people are starting to notice more and more, hey, our air quality is getting a little worse. Our waterways are getting a little more polluted. Some of our forests are getting deforested. Species-wide extinctions seem to be picking up. So, and it's just intensified. And I don't think I have to tell you that we've had a lot of global warming and sea levels rising, Arctic ice caps melting, so on and on and on. A lot of tough things happening planetary-wise in terms of the environment. But in the 70s, the movement started, and Garrett Hardin calls out for critique a common metaphor that was used by the early environmentalist movement of his day, which was spaceship Earth metaphor. So Hardin is not a fan of that metaphor, and I'm going to try and explain why he doesn't like that metaphor and what it is. So Garrett Hardin, he doesn't like the so-called spaceship Earth metaphor of the environmentalist movement of his time. And here's what the spaceship Earth metaphor is. It asks us to kind of conceptualize our planet as a spaceship that we're all riding along as passengers. Obviously, that's not, I guess, literally true, but in a sense, it's not completely wrong either. I mean, it is a big sphere floating through space, and we are all on it as it orbits the sun and rotates on its axis. So imagine, if you will, that we characterize our planet as spaceship Earth, and we're all just we're crew members of spaceship Earth as we ride along on the so-called ship. It's supposed to induce within us some kind of appreciation of how we all share a common home. We're all just riders on this ship, and therefore we should sort of see it as a shared place of human habitation. Therefore, it's a call to conserve and sustain the planet, to not use, waste, or destroy more than our fair share of the resources, and to be equitable in the way that we distribute resources. If we all share life on this planet and it's our only home and it's our like spaceship, so to speak, then maybe that impresses upon you some kind of feeling of obligation to take good care of it and to again share the resources with the other people. But Hardin's not a fan of the metaphor, and here's why. He says, first of all, if we take the metaphor seriously, it kind of urges us to think that everyone has an equal right to an equal share of the global resources. And even if it sounds nice to say that, Hardin doesn't agree. He says, if we actually lived according to that, that would usher in self destructive policies for the liquidation of the accumulated wealth of the more prosperous nations and entities to create a more equal distribution of that globally. But that would eliminate the beacons of prosperity that the wealthier nations serve as. And it wouldn't be acceptable. I mean, as an example, suppose that you come home from work or school one night and come back to your home, apartment, whatever, dorm, and you see a person that's now in your home on the couch that you've never seen before. And just suppose you're like, you need to leave, you have no right to be here. This isn't your house, this isn't your apartment, etc. Suppose they come back and say this, like, okay, well, I understand what you're telling me, but the thing is, I'm homeless, right? I have nowhere to live. I sleep under the open air. I sleep under like a bridge. You have a whole extra bedroom in here that no one's even using. It's unoccupied. Speaking for myself, I have a 4-bedroom house, and it's just me and my wife. So we got like 3 bedrooms open at any given time. Imagine this person says that to you. They're like, how can you justifiably say that I can't stay in this house if you have open, unused space and I've got literally nowhere to sleep? Now, even if you felt sympathetic to their cause and you felt badly for the poverty that they're experiencing, I'm sure you would probably respond back to be like, well, look, that is sad, but at the same time, I'm entitled to have greater access to income and wealth because it's not necessarily like we have to equally share all of those things. Now, taken to the international level of nations, you could reach a similar conclusion. Somebody might think that if we really thought of it as Spaceship Earth, then the wealthier nations need to give a lot of that money back to the poor nations so that we're all sharing, right? But again, are we entitled to an equal share of the world's resources? Perhaps there's justification for an inequality in wealth and income. Furthermore, he says, another problem with the metaphor is that if it's really a spaceship, the metaphor is not actually appropriate to the circumstances of the world, because a real spaceship or any ship has to have a captain to navigate it around and steer it on its course. But there's no such corollary to that in reality. We don't have like a captain of the planet Earth. In other words, we don't have a international global leader of the whole planet. We just have individual sovereign nations, each of which has their own leadership. So until there's like a president of planet Earth dictating and directing the actions of all the entities and nations on the planet, he also thinks that's another reason to find fault with the metaphor, because it doesn't apply in the sense that there's no like single captain of the planet. Now, there is the United Nations, which he acknowledges, but he points out that they're not a true international authority because they have no like standing military and they have no ability to enforce their mandates except by treaties that are entered into by the member nations. So whatever power or authority they do have is derivative of the power and authority taken by the individual nations, which kind of form it. So he thinks we should replace this metaphor, Spaceship Earth, with his chosen metaphor that he believes is more appropriate to the circumstances of the reality. So he mentions a quick statistic that 2/3 of the world's nations are poor. So that's clearly the majority. And 1/3, the complement of that, obviously, of the world's nations are wealthy. So 2/3 of the world's nations poor, 1/3 of the world's nations wealthy, with the United States, our nation, at the tip of the wealth pyramid, the wealthiest country in history ever, and including globally today. So he thinks here's a better metaphor. He calls it the lifeboat metaphor. So So Hardin says that we should, instead of embracing the spaceship Earth metaphor of the environmentalist movement that he criticized, we should rather defer to the so-called lifeboat metaphor that he offers. And here's how his lifeboat metaphor goes. One second, I just need to erase this thing on the board, so I need to grab my paper towel here. Because I need to do a quick little drawing for you to give you his metaphor. Okay, so here's his little lifeboat metaphor. He says, imagine that each nation that's got wealth, a wealthy nation, we symbolize them metaphorically as a lifeboat that's floating in the ocean. So say this here is Lifeboat USA. That's our lifeboat. And here's people inside of that lifeboat floating out in the ocean. Now, the lifeboat is a metaphor for a wealthy country. And so since the United States is a wealthy country, there's Lifeboat USA. But it's not the only lifeboat. Like there's Lifeboat England, France, Germany, Japan, and other major first world economies. They're all a lifeboat, as so to speak. The passengers within the lifeboat, they are obviously supposed to be a symbol or a metaphor for the citizens that reside within those wealthy nations. So me and you, for example, we'd be like riding along inside the Lifeboat USA to just advance the example. And he plays with numbers a little bit here, okay? I can't forget, there's some other characters, okay? So we've got our people in the boat that are the so-called citizens of the nations. There's also, though, there's a bunch of people out in the water. Put these exclamation points because these people in the water are having a tough time. The people in the water are since they're not on a boat at all, they're constantly at risk of death. They're facing this possibility of drowning, running out of food. It's just a constant struggle for these folks that are in the water. Now, we now give some numbers. He gives you some numbers to consider. He says, suppose that in Lifeboat USA, we have 50 people. So N of the members of the boat, it's 50, but there's a total capacity for 60. So it's not fully maxed out in terms of how many people it could hold. It could accommodate 10 more, but it's got 50 so far. In the water, he says, let's suppose there's 100 people out there in the water, so it's more numerous. Now, why is he choosing this ratio of numbers? It's pretty much to track with the ratio of wealthy to poor nations that were mentioned in the statistic within the chat that I typed out. Because it says there that 1/3 of the world's nations are wealthy and 2/3 are poor. So 150, if that's a number to just use for the sake of discussion, 100 is 2/3 of that, and 50 is 1/3 of that. So this kind of mirrors the ratio of wealthy to poor nations that he was talking about. Anyway, so I have all kinds of problems with the example, but I think that it's too simple-minded and not very generous. But let's just try this. He sets himself up to kind of hit a home run by making a very overly simplistic analogy, I would argue. But let's try it and ask. Suppose that we take all 100 people from the water into the boat, because these people, they would love to join the boat. They would love to join in the boat so that they could enjoy the prosperous lifestyle that the people within the boat currently enjoy. But there's 100 of them. So what he's saying is, what if you really brought all 100 onto the boat? That's not going to work, because then what would probably happen, or at least according to the way he's framing the example, if you bring 100 onto this current boat, it's going to cause what result? Simple enough, I think, but let me know. It's going to sink, right? It's going to capsize. It's going to have an overwhelming number of people on it. It can no longer stay afloat. And now the boat sinks. And if that's the case, now we don't even have a boat to serve the needs of any number of people, even the smaller number that is already on there. So this is what that's supposed to imply in the larger scope of the discussion. There are too many people in the world that have needs. And if we try to help all the people who have needs, all the people who need help, that would overwhelm the capacity that we have to provide for that number of people. So if you tried to provide assistance to every member of the third world that needs it or that would want it, it would overwhelm the resources available to provide for, and we would no longer even have capacity to do anything. So that won't work. What if we don't take on 100? What's another option, an alternative to taking on 100 that might not cause the boat to sink? Can you think of a different possibility? Let me know if you can, because he kind of leads to that. He sort of implies that within the description of the case. So don't bring on 100, but maybe what? Only take the max amount. That's right. So just take 10 more, perhaps, because as you can see, the boat currently is housing 50, but there's room for 10. Even there, though, Hardin, he throws up obstacles. What he says is, first off, how are you going to choose which 10? There's 100 out there. 10 is not all of them. How are you going to determine which 10? They all have needs. It's not going to seem very fair to the other 90 that they weren't selected. But I don't find that to be the most important problem, because even if you had to design some kind of lottery system, you could certainly devise some mechanism by which to admit 10 more onto the boat. So suppose that you found some kind of procedure to admit 10 to the boat, and now there's 60 on the boat. It doesn't cause the boat to sink because it's built for 60 max. But if you have the boat completely filled to the capacity, he says there's still a cost to that for the people that were already comfortably living on the boat. Now the boat is filled to its maximum capacity, so you sacrifice the excess room and space that would have otherwise provided a little bit of a margin, a safety margin. It's kind of like when you go into a public building or a classroom or something. Sometimes when you do that, you'll see like a note that's put on the door posted somewhere that says, hey, from the fire marshal, try not to exceed maximum occupancy, and they'll give a set number. And if you're in a room like that and some emergency broke out, would you really want it to be filled to its maximum number? Or would you like for there to be a little bit of excess room so that there could be a more orderly evacuation or whatever? If you were in a nightclub and it caught on fire and it was absolutely packed, it would probably be much more dangerous for you and the people within it than if it had some spare room. So he says it's not completely cost-free in terms of the situation for the people that are already on the boat. By taking on 10 more, it's not like the boat will sink necessarily, but it does eliminate some of the value of the safety margin. Now, here's a problem I find, just talking about this example. I feel like he's kind of getting the metaphor a little twisted, because his argument seems to be intending that we don't have obligations to assist the global poor. I would have thought that that meant we don't have an obligation to send money out through charitable donations. But what he's talking about here sounds a little bit more like an anti-immigration argument. Like, oh, let's not let so many people into the current system because it will tax the system and provide more people within it than will be comfortable for the people that are already living there. So which one is it, Hardin? Is it, should we not be sending money as charity, or should we not be having like very permissive immigration policies? Honestly, though, Hardin kind of wants both. He's argued in other places that he also wants to take a hard line against permissive immigration protocols for similar reasons. But I find that to be totally distasteful and uncharitable, because it's a nation of immigrants, right? We've all, unless you're a Native American person, you have come at some point in your background and through your family history from distant shores. So how can we arrive as immigrants and then think that it's the best thing for us to close the door to others that are coming later? But anyway, Hardin, he understands these objections, and he's got his argument nonetheless. So that's kind of his spaceship. I meant to say lifeboat metaphor. The other thing I don't really like about his paper is the style of writing, because he trolls the reader a little bit if he thinks that the reader is somebody with more humanitarian feelings. He kind of almost writes in a way where he thinks those people are naive or just misguided. Normally in philosophy and professional academic writing, there's a principle of charity that you're supposed to live by, which is you always try to treat your intellectual opponent with respect, and you try to take their arguments with dignity and honor. But he kind of just trashes people that don't agree with him. And so he lights into people like this. You can read in his book. He says, approximately 2/3 of the world is desperately poor and only 1/3 is rich. The people in poor countries have an average per capita of about $200 per year. The rich of about 3,000. The people in poor countries have an average per capita gross national product of about $200 per year. The rich of about 3,000. Metaphorically, each rich nation amounts to a lifeboat full of comparatively rich people. The poor of the world are in other much more crowded lifeboats, continuously, so to speak. The poor fall out of their lifeboats and swim for a while in the water outside, hoping to be admitted to a rich lifeboat, or in some other way to benefit from the, in scare quote, goodies on board, as if this is just people wanting handouts instead of just being born into poverty. What should the passengers of the rich lifeboat do? This is the central problem. First, we must acknowledge that each lifeboat has is effectively limited in capacity. Just like the land of every nation has a limited carrying capacity. The exact limit is a matter of argument, but the energy crunch is convincing more people every day that we have already exceeded the carrying capacity of the land. He says, let's look at only one lifeboat, ours. The ethical problem is the same for all, and it is as follows. Here we sit, say 50 people in our boat. To be generous, let us assume the boat has a capacity of 10 more, making 60. The 50 of us in the lifeboat see 100 others swimming in the water outside, asking for admission to the boat or for handouts. How shall we respond to their calls? There are several possibilities. One, we may be tempted to try to live by the Christian idea, be our brother's keeper, or by the Marxist idea, from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. Since the needs of all are the same, we take all the needy people into the boat, making a total of 150 in a boat designed for 60. The boat is then swamped, and everyone drowns. In this case, complete justice is a complete catastrophe. So here again, we get some of these rhetorical asides where he kind of lights into people that would have a more deferential attitude toward the poor. He's like, if you think it's just to be generous and beneficent to the poor, then justice is a catastrophe. It's kind of like a little bit sarcastic. He then says, two, since the boat has an unused excess capacity of 10, we admit just 10 more to it. This has the disadvantage of getting rid of the safety factor, for which action we will sooner or later pay dearly. Moreover, which 10 do we let in? First come, first serve, the best 10, the neediest 10? How do we distinguish? And what will we say to the 90 who are excluded? I've had some students that have taken this class from me in the past. Oh, by the way, Marina, Hardin assumes overpopulation is the main problem and doesn't take into consideration resource scarcity is often due to unequal distribution, not absolute lack of resources. Oh yeah, absolutely. That's totally true. So I think you're spot on with your observation and criticism. And whenever I teach this, I sort of say those similar things and try to convey my own feelings about his argument and my own skepticism about his argument. He then says the best option is to be really harsh. Don't let anyone in from the water in the boat metaphor. And he says that. Admit no more to the boat and preserve the safety factors. Survival of the people in the lifeboat is then possible, although we will always have to be on guard against those that would board without proper authorization. And so he knows that some people will hear that and they'll be like, how abhorrent is that? How ungenerous and calloused is that? And then he gives that really, I find, distasteful love it or leave it type argument. He's like, if you really are that guilty to be so fortunate to be in the boat, you could always do this. And I'm sure you know what he will say next. You could just get out, just jump out and yield your place to someone in the water. Let them exchange places with you. And if enough people do that, then the boat will be purged of all those that have a guilty conscience. And it will just contain people who have no degree of guilt for their good circumstances in the boat. Here again, though, he's getting a little off the rails because that doesn't correspond to any real life policy that exists anywhere in the world. Like, I can't exchange my citizenship with another person in the third world, grant them mine, and let them occupy my position instead. Also, when he talks about this safety factor, he says when the boat's full to 60, you're playing right at the margins. But I've had some students that are like engineering students, and they've said, that's actually an abuse of the concept of the engineering principle called the safety factor. Because when it says it has a maximum capacity, we build these structures and so on so that they can withstand a little bit more than what's listed as the maximum. So when you get into an elevator and it says like don't exceed 2,000 pounds, it doesn't mean that if you get to 2,001 pounds, it's automatically cable's going to snap and it's going to just crash. It's built to have excess yield beyond that. So the way that he describes it is if you get close to this max number, catastrophic things are going to happen. But that doesn't even really align with the whole concept of the safety factor as it's discussed in its own terms. But he takes that example and he just kind of runs with it from there. He talks about the differing reproductive rates of first and third world countries. He said that if we were to assign a moral, a philanthropic system by donating from, like, say, 300 million Americans to 300 million poor people in countries where there's global poverty, that they would out-reproduce us over a span of time. Because, not to worry, thanks, Rosemary. You're all good. I'll see you then next time on Tuesday. If we started at an initial time, 300 million to 300 million, there'd be a ratio of 1 to 1. You say here, Ryan, whoever, people with the best, most diverse genetics should fight, take control, live to make humanity thrive at 80% capacity. I don't know, it's a strange suggestion, honestly. I can't quite determine. Anybody fighting and trying to take control, it sounds a little bit more like imperialism. It sounds a little bit more like a bit disregarding of the inherent value of life, because if we fight, people are going to kill each other. there might be a more humanitarian alternative to that, but we'll see. Um, but what he says is that, like, because of the different reproductive rates, if you start off at a ratio of 1 to 1 from donors to recipients, because in wealthy nations it takes about 87 years for the population to double if current rates remain stable, which is also kind of a maybe problematic assumption. Poor nations double in population about every 35 years. So if it's today we start the program and these rates never changed, then 35 years later, the cohort of poor would have doubled from 300 to 600 million. 35 years later than that, they would have doubled from 600 million to like 1.2 billion. And then to get to the 87-year mark, would have to go through another half cycle of doubling. So by the time we get to 600 million, 87 years later, the poor cohort has doubled, and almost doubled a third time. So the ratio gets worse and worse. It's like it started as 1 to 1 donor to recipient, but then it becomes like 1 to maybe 4 or more. And so he says this would assign us an ever-increasing philanthropic burden that would ultimately become unsustainable. So it's better not to even go down that road and instead just try to maintain our own posterity and so forth. The tragedy of the commons, yes. So the tragedy of the commons is from Garrett Hardin. And the thing is, it's like we're running low on time, so I haven't really been able to express it, but I'll just say it very briefly. The tragedy of the commons concept comes from Garrett Hardin's writing. It's probably the most well-known thing that he has written about. And I would say that is kind of an economic concept that, at least just considered by itself, it does have some validity and it's somewhat interesting. The tragedy of the commons says that public resources are destined to fail for 2 major reasons: overutilization and poor maintenance. But private resources don't suffer that problem, because when something's privately owned or held, then the private owners take care to make sure that it doesn't get overutilized or poorly maintained, because if it did, it would deprive them of the value of their own investment, which they have every vested interest not to let happen. So he gives an example, Hardin does, of 1 acre of farmland. He says, suppose that this 1 acre of farmland was made available for public use. What would happen? Anybody that has any need at all to raise farm animals, grow crops, bring farm machinery, they would all rush to use that acre, because why wouldn't they? It's not restricted in access. Now it's open to the public. So we'll quickly get overloaded with too many farm animals, too much farming. It would get overgrazed, and then it would become no longer useful for any number of people. Also, in the 1 acre that's public, nobody's going to do their part to maintain its sustainability, because why would they work hard at doing that, since it's not their private property and it doesn't belong to them? So on the other hand, if the 1 acre was owned by a private owner or owners, they would make sure that it doesn't get overloaded, because if it did, it would undermine the value of what they spent their own money on. And they would also try to maintain its sustainability, because if it was destroyed by unsustainable use, then that would be a loss of property and the value of the property. So he thinks that in a way, the World Food Bank and other organizations like this that try to ship money and resources from the first world to the third world, that they're commons in disguise, because they create a public resource of available food and money that will be drawn on with no limitation from the poor nations. And the way they will fail to make this a sustainable practice is by continuing to reproduce at these rates, such that at some future time there'll be too many poor people, not enough resources to care for all of them, and then we have an even bigger problem. But I do think that he ignores certain things. For one, he talks about these reproductive rates as if they're like written in stone and they can never change. But you would have expected that they actually would start to decline if some of these nations, perhaps through some manner of international provision of aid, could start to make a transition to a more developed living standard. I mean, it's almost like there's this kind of, I feel, disturbing idea that some countries are just destined to always be poor or less prosperous. So there's all kinds of issues. We could say more, but we're running definitely short on time. Marina, you said that's how I got to know some of his ideas in an econ class. Didn't know about his ideas in this field that we're discussing now. Interesting. Yeah. The tragedy of the commons is something that's taught often in econ type classes. And I would say there is some validity to it in other cases, like say the world's water and air. Nobody owns it. It's just there. And that, because of that, like companies feel free to pollute with no limitations the air and water systems. So they pollute it and they take from it because it's not theirs. If it was privately owned, you might think, well, if people own the water and air, then they would have every reason not to allow it to get so polluted. But I don't know if privatization of the world's air and water would necessarily be the solution either, because corporate mismanagement of privately held entities is also something that sometimes doesn't work out. So we'll see how we manage these things as we continue through into our 21st century. But that's just a little food for thought for you guys. For now, though, I'm going to let us all go. We've reached the end of our time today. But don't forget to work on those papers if you haven't already. You get them ready for me for Tuesday, and then you'll just be able to email them. Other than that, have a good weekend, and feel free to say bye. I appreciate all you guys being here. So I'll be talking to you and seeing you soon. Okay, guys, thank you so much. Appreciate each one of you for being here. Take it easy then, and I'll be talking to you guys after the weekend. Okay, bye-bye.